In this video, we'll break down and recreate the iconic opening title sequence from the smash hit Squid Game, all in After Effects with no plugins. Let's jump right into it. TipTut. Hello everybody and welcome back to TipTut. Today we are in After Effects, and that's right, I'm jumping on the Squid Game bandwagon to show you how to recreate these really cool and iconic opening title sequences. We're not going to recreate this exactly. Instead, I'm going to show you the techniques I use to create something of our own, because that's much more creative and fun than just tracing this. So let's just jump right into it. You can download the resources for this tutorial from my website, www.tiptut.xyz. So if you're following along exactly, then once you download the resources, you'll see you have two files here, a video file in which I have added just some shapes to a basic beach sort of scene here to give us our little intro shot. And then there'll also be a Photoshop file inside of which includes some of the Hangul shapes that we're going to need, characters. So let's just drag that video in first, and you have to do it separately, otherwise you don't get the right settings when you drag in the Photoshop file. And we want composition, retain layer sizes, and merge layer styles into footage. That's totally fine. Okay. And what this will give us is our intro background and a composition with all of the Photoshop layers that we need. And this includes our shapes from before, just in case you want to change those on your version, and our Hangul characters for what these shapes will resolve into. So I'll just drop all of those into my assets layer, and then we'll go to new composition here, and we'll just call this one Squid Game. 1920 by 1080, 30 frames per second is fine, and give yourselves about 20 seconds to work with. And then in there, we're just going to drag our Squid Game intro bg.mp4, and that's going to give us our background file that we're working with. Now, looking at the original footage here, we can see that the lines of these shapes kind of burn in and scale up in their stroke width. So that's what we'll be recreating first, this first step. And the footage in the background kind of fades away. And it does take quite a long time to do this, something around 3 or 4 seconds. So easily then, let's go to say 1 second in. Let's bring up our opacity keyframes by pressing T, and then just fade that out quite slowly, like so. So there's our first step, nice and simple. What we're going to do first is recreate these shapes and the burn-in effect. So to do that, very simple. Obviously, we're just going to go up to our shape layers. Let's long press until we get to our polygon tool. And then if you click and drag and you don't see a triangle, you should press Shift up or down to add or decrease the amount of sides on your polygon until you get something that you're happy with. Get it roughly the same size as your sand sketch layers here, and then press Control Alt and Home. Microphone is right in front of Home, and then position that triangle in the correct spot over the top. Make sure you deselect that layer after you name it, of course, Triangle Main, so that when you create your circle now by long pressing and pressing on the ellipse tool, you know that you are on a separate layer. To do this from the center, just hold Control and Shift to scale from the center, like so. And it doesn't have to match up perfectly, so you can just select both those layers and choose Align to Selection Center so that you know it's perfectly in the middle. And we'll do the same thing here for the circle, Control Alt and Home to bring that into the middle as well. And of course, we'll call that Circle Top. So let's just go through and continue to do all of that. We'll obviously need a rectangle, we'll need some triangles, and to do the line, I'm just going to use the pen tool to create like so. So let's fast forward through this section. So once you've done that, you should have something that looks a little bit like this. Now, the first step, if we go back to our Squid Game intro scene, is we need these shapes to do 3 things. Okay, we need them to start blurry and resolve completely sharp. We need them to start thin and become thick. And we need them to kind of burn in certain places, like as if they're fading in slowly and patchily. So that's the first step. And then the second, we'll be moving on to the transitions. So this is actually a very simple technique. It's a combination of 3 techniques. I'm going to select all of my layers here. I'm going to press U to collapse everything down, and then double tap U to bring up all of the options. Now we need to do this because we need to click the stroke width of every single shape. And you can't just copy and paste the keyframes because of course they're inside different shapes here. One is a polystar, one is a rectangle, one is a stroke, etc., etc. So we're just going to click stroke width on all of these that we see. And that's perfect. And then if we select them all and press U twice again, it should collapse them down and just show the keyframes that we've got. I'm going to say it's going to take about 2 seconds for this to resolve. So I'm just going to press Control-Shift-Right to move over by 10 frames and do that 6 times, obviously, because we're in a 30 frames per second document here. Let's add in another row of keyframes, and then back on the first ones, let's just bring that down to 0. I found about 14, a stroke width of about 14 works well here. So now we have our strokes coming up from 0 to 14, which is perfect for us. However, we need it to blur and we need it to burn in as well. So I'm going to press Control, Alt and Y to add a new adjustment layer on top, which we will rename to Burn Blur, just so we know what it's doing. And let's go to our Effects and Presets panel. And in there, we're going to type in our good old friend Gaussian Blur. And we'll just drag that Gaussian Blur onto our adjustment layer. Let's keyframe the blurriness from the same time frame. So we'll press U and just keyframe that. And back on the first one here, let's put it up to about 30, see what that looks like. Now, obviously that's affecting the footage as well, which is not what we want, but we'll get to that in a moment. What we're also going to add now is a CC burn film. So CC burn film. Let's drag that onto our adjustment layer as well. Now that we've got everything we need and set up on our adjustment layer, let's select the adjustment layer and all of our shapes, right click and choose pre-compose. And we'll move all attributes to the new composition. That's fine. And we'll just call this squid lines. What that does is allows us to drop inside this composition here. And now, of course, only our burn and our blurring will only affect the shape layers beneath it. So let's go to about halfway so we can kind of see what's going on here. And we will turn up the burn to say about 50. Now, as you can see, this is already making it quite patchy. But I'm just going to move the center of this by clicking this center option here. And I'm just going to bring it up to the right a little bit, just so that it covers a wider area. I'm going to keep dragging until our shapes are pretty much completely gone. And then we're going to go back to our first keyframe. And we're going to choose that burn. Let's put it on 70, so it's not on 69. Let's press U again to bring up those keyframes and then just turn the burn down to 0. As you can see, we now have our patchy, blurry, growing shapes like so. Now, the final thing, of course, let's take a look at this, is that there is a slow drift in on the camera here. It doesn't matter too much for us, but as you can see, after that, our shapes begin to grow and shrink. So that will be phase 2, which we'll move on to now. But the final phase, which will be phase 3, will be adding all of these nice ambient occlusion kind of effects here and some of the little drop shadows that you can see on the text shapes. So step 2, the next step is the fun bit, animating all these shapes. So there are 2 steps to animating these shapes, and that's the shapes that start in this original section here and resolve in the second section. So that will of course be things like this triangle, which scales down and moves over. So it exists during the entire process. And I think that's actually the only bit on this one. The rest of the shapes either trim themselves down to nothing and then expand into something else, or just start from nothing, like if you watch this shape here, and then just resolve into existing on the second part. So stage 1 is deciding which of these shapes here are going to end up in our final shape. To do that, we need our final shape. So what I'm going to do is just go back to our Squid Game Sand Layers folder, and I'm just going to drag in this after composition, which is just the folder that has all of our Hangul. Again, sorry if I'm butchering that pronunciation. Again, I got help from this Hangul from a South Korean friend of mine, but of course any mistakes in it are mine and mine alone. So apologies if this is just gibberish. I tried my best. I'm going to bring the opacity of that down to about, let's say 20, just so we can kind of see it, but we know it's not part of the finished thing. And we're going to use this as a guide to see which shapes will translate well over. Now, I can already tell if I just hide some of these layers here, I can already tell that our circle is going to be useful, and we already have a vertical line that I know is going to be useful and able to translate as well. But none of these other shapes are going to be able to translate directly. Unfortunately, this Hangul doesn't have any triangles or anything like that in it, but that's not going to stop us. This rectangle here might work transitioning nicely up into this kind of E shape and that sort of thing. So you'll just need to decide which of these you want to remain and which you want to transition completely into new shapes. We're going to start by doing the circle and the line, and then I'll fast forward through the rest because by that point you should understand the process. So let's jump right into it. Let's grab our circle, and first of all I'm just going to pop this on top of everything else, and for now I'm just going to hide all the other layers as well so they're not distracting. And let's say I want this to start moving just before everything finishes resolving. Okay. So let's go to our final keyframe marks and let's press Control-Shift left to go back about 10 frames. And let's do it once more time. So 20 frames backwards. No, let's stick with 10. So now, as you can see, we've got it just about resolving before we begin to animate. Now, how we're going to animate this is very simple. We're just going to click Add on this little drop-down menu here, choose Add and choose Trim Paths. If you twirl down that trim path, you'll see you have a start and an end keyframe. And I can drag these to adjust where our line starts and stops. I'm just going to drag it down just a little bit. And then we're going to choose the offset so that our offset animation starts from the bottom of the circle here. So that's obviously going to be 180 degrees because we've just rotated it around halfway. What this means is we're obviously going to start with our end position at 100%. So let's keyframe that. And let's say maybe a second later. So that's Control-Shift right 3 times. Let's drag that all the way down to 0. So really simply, we've now just got this shape starting to decrease like so. We don't want it to be quite so linear. Let's say it starts slowly. So let's select that keyframe, press F9 to give it an easy ease. And now it's going to start a little bit slowly. But we don't want it to end slowly because we want this to continue to transition into a new section. So I'm going to grab this circle top and I'm just going to make the layer color red so it's easier to see. So we'll do that. Sorry, I'm not in Premiere Pro, I am in After Effects. So we'll just choose red from that little drop down menu there. Now, at the same point that this animation stops, we want the next animation to start. So I want to draw with no layer selected. I want to draw a new line. So I'm going to go up to my pen tool here, make sure my stroke width is the same. And I'm just going to move back just a little bit so I can see where that line begins. And we're just going to click right in the middle there. We're going to move over to, say, holding Shift maybe around here to give us a perfectly straight line. Before we do anything else, we're going to pop this layer in the right position. We're going to call it Circle Line, i.e. the line that comes off of the circle. So press Enter and then rename it to Circle Line. And then we're going to make sure it lines up correctly. So once again, Control, Alt, and Home to make it the anchor point in the middle. And we'll just make this red as well, so we know that at a glance, they're all part of the same group. Let's zoom all the way in, and let's just use the D-pad to make sure there's no unsightly marks lining up here. So you want it to basically start at exactly the point where the other one stops. So we'll just line that up until that middle section disappears. Beautiful. Okay. Let's go back to our pen tool, and with the layer selected, just click on one end like so. And now holding Shift, I'm going to try and find the middle of this circle here where we want it to resolve into. And holding Shift allows me to draw a perfect straight line. If you're getting a little bit of adaptive resolution, you find it distracting, you can turn that off down here by clicking this button, choose Off Final Quality, and that'll stop that kind of quick blurring as it tries to render it as quick as possible. Can be quite distracting for this scenario. Now we want to, with that layer deselected, go back to our circle tool, our ellipse tool, and with no layer selected, we're going to just fill in this circle here. Doesn't have to be perfect because, of course, we're going to actually remove the original Hangul. Let's pop that in the right position. Let's rename it to Circle Red. And that's because this is actually going to be changing color. So we'll just choose red on that one there. And again, we'll zoom in and we'll just make sure that it lines up nice and perfect. Great. Now, back to our keyframes. Let's press U on these to bring them up. And on our circle line here, we're just going to twirl this down, add trim path. And where our previous animation from the circle top ends, we're going to begin our new one. We'll keyframe this, but we won't ease it because we want this animation to be linear. Move over a second again, but again, I might be tweaking this. And we'll just drag that end all the way up. So now, as you can see, we have a shape that starts off empty and transitions into the new shape. We do want a little bit of overlap, but let's get all of our animations sorted first, and then we can go back and get the timing correct. So once that line has finished animating its end, let's go to our circle red, add trim paths. Again, let's crank this one down, and you can see here it's starting in the wrong spot. So we want to rotate this one. Let's offset it, and it's going to be 90 degrees. What that does is allows us to go from our end of our animation all the way through around 360 degrees. So let's keyframe that. Let's move over 1 second again. Let's drag it up to 100. And this time, of course, we will ease it out because we want this one not to be linear. We want it to slow out. So let's take a look at what we've got so far. Okay. This circle here undoes itself, extends, and reconstitutes itself over there. But of course, we're left with this weird, unsightly tail that we don't want. So as you can see, we have our circle starting to decrease here, but we really want it to look like it's a continuous line. At the moment, it completely disappears and then reappears on the next step, which is no good. That's a real easy fix. Let's just go back here to the end of our circle top animation, maybe move back, say 10 frames. And let's just move these other 10 frames, other frames back 10 frames as well. So Alt, Shift, and Left will move keyframes back. What this means is this animation will start before the other one stops, which makes it look like a continuous line, okay? And you'll see here that you kind of want the same amount of length on this bit. So it looks a little bit short there. So maybe what we can do is just move it back a few more to keep that length of line correct. So boom. Okay, that looks okay. Another way to do this is, of course, you can leave those keyframes where they are. And you can just try moving this first keyframe back all the way to the start of the animation and ease that one out with F9. What this means is this line will start to grow as soon as that other line begins to shrink. Might look a little bit nicer, okay? So let's say that one shouldn't take 2 seconds. It should just take 1, so we can shift that back. And this will just be playing until you get something you're happy with. Now, I think I like that. That looks quite nice, very smooth. So now we need this line to shrink, this second line, this circle line. So we can bring up our keyframes again by twirling this down, and this time we need to animate the start position. So let's take our start position, keyframe that at 0, go to our end keyframe here and keyframe the start position again at 100%. Now we can just offset those changes. So we'll take those keyframes, Alt Shift right. And now as that grows, this other one will shrink. But we obviously don't want that to begin until this one ends. So we'll put that in the right position, like so. Now, as it reaches its full extent, that line is just going to continue to shrink out until it disappears entirely. So I'd say that section is now done. Looking very nice, okay? Of course, another way to do this would be to just draw your entire shape from one path rather than doing it with separate shapes. But I found that that means your circles have to be bang on perfect drawing a path with a pen, which is quite difficult. So that's why I do it this way. So final step then, we've obviously got this, but we want that to start at different times. Let's do the same technique, okay? So here we have one shape ending. And of course, the other shape begins to move as soon as that other one begins to move as well. So we'll say as soon as that shape hits here, we'd like this final shape to start moving. So we'll move those over. It's going to be linear, of course, and it's going to grow like so. And this one's nice and simple. We don't actually want this one to end. So that's all we need for that. So let's take a look at our shapes. Very nice. Okay. Final step for this one then will be to change the colors to red. And we actually need to change both the circle and this line here, because the line continues to exist after the circle changes color. So I'd say if we look back at our Squid Game intro sequence, we can see here that the shapes begin to turn red before they finish settling and become completely pink by the time that they've stopped. So let's go back and say, let's do it from here, from this keyframe, keep everything neat. Not only does it help you keep things neat when you're working on it, but it actually gives it that nice sense of timing and rhythm if all your keyframes are aligned correctly. Okay, so to do that, very simple. We're just going to take circle red here. We're going to press double U, that's U twice, until it brings up our shapes like so. And we're going to twirl down stroke. So we're going to click the twirl down on stroke twice, and that'll bring up all of the options, not just the options you've keyframed. And we will keyframe color. Let's move over 2 seconds. Let's say it takes longer for the full animation to change to pink. Let's click this little drop down and we'll just choose a nice bright pink color. Not super worried about getting it exactly right. That looks about correct to me. Press U to collapse that down. Now you should do the colors last because you get this huge colored bar on the timeline here, which can be quite distracting. So you should make sure you're fairly happy with your animation before you do the color segments. Let's take a look at that. Very nice. Okay, as you can see, you get this weird unsightly join here as this line connects to the changing pink line. Very easy fix. We just have to do the same thing on the other line as well. So double U, that's U twice. Twirl down stroke, keyframe color. Let's just click this arrow here to immediately jump over there, and we can eyedrop that pink. Boom, very nice. Press U to collapse it. And now our transition to pink looks seamless. I'd say that's a little bit slow. So let's move these back to 1 second and see what that looks like. Perfect. Okay. Let's take a little look at the whole thing. Nice. I'd say that moves a little bit quickly for my liking. I'm going to grab all of my keyframes apart from these first ones here. And I'm just going to press Alt-Shift once just to drag that out and make it a little bit slower. There we go. Just so it starts a little bit slower like that. You're looking for an even rhythm all the way throughout. Okay, so that's pretty much the technique that we're going to be using for all of this. So let's take a look at our other shapes. Let's turn back on our other shapes here. And as you can see, once you've started animating it, you can see how this is really going to come to life once all of these shapes are moving. So let's do one with just a single path then, rather than 3 different shapes. And then those will be the techniques that we'll be using for pretty much all of this. So I'll do the rest in fast forward mode, but let's show you the other technique for now. So the other technique is to do one single path for everything. So let's do that with the simplest one so it doesn't get too confusing. I'm going to hide everything apart from our line, and I'll turn our line back on. Now I'm leaving the animation that we've already done on because we want to see how those other lines might intersect with it. For example, I don't want this line here to come upwards and cross over with that too much, but I might want it to come downwards through the rectangle, zigzag into position, maybe following the shapes similar to one of these paths here. Okay, so let's try something like that. Let's go to our first keyframe on our others here, and we can just collapse these down now because we don't need them. But on our line, I'm going to press Ctrl-Alt-Home because we need to anchor that point in the middle just in case we choose to rotate it. And then with the pen tool, let's select the endpoint of this line. Now we're going to leave this point here because that's going to give us a really easy visual aid to see where it actually started. And let's say we just extend this down a bit. So we'll just press Shift click to bring that in, and let's zoom out so we can see like the whole canvas. Let's have it come over. Let's have it come up. Maybe it can zigzag into position. So I'm just holding Shift while I click here. And I want this to line up, if we can, roughly, just roughly, with the bottom of our shape here. Hold Shift again and go to the top of our shape. So now we have a completely full path that our shape line is going to take. You guessed it, we're going to twirl this down and choose Add Trim Path. But making sure we start where we want to, we're going to grab our trim path here and take this end all the way down until we can see the point in our line, our original point right here. And let's move over a little bit so that the blur is gone from that layer effect. Or, of course, alternatively, you could just, for now, turn off your burn and blur adjustment layer. And let's just bring that down and see where we are. So it looks like 9% is a little bit too small and 10 is a bit too large. So let's try 9.5. Not quite there. Let's try 10.5. Slightly too big, 10.3. There we go, perfect. Doesn't have to be perfect, of course, but now we know that our original shape here is going to continue to fit in the animation that we've already done, okay, which is obviously quite important. So going back to our starting position, let's press U because we now have our trim lines in place. Let's make sure it has a keyframe on it. So trim path, let's trim the end and let's trim the start keyframe whilst we're here as well. Just so we've got that keyframe up, we don't need to get it later on. Okay, so let's hit F9 on those 2 keyframes there so that we start with an eased position. And let's go over, say, 3 seconds. And let's bring up our end position to 100%. And our start position all the way up until we get just over this corner. So you have to be careful here because you'll see that if you don't do it exactly, you get an unsightly little bulge like this. So let's try, instead of 85, let's try 86%. A little bit too short, so let's try 85.3. There you go, that's about perfect. So now if you wanted to, if you liked the way that looked, you could, of course, leave it as it is. It moves quite simply through there. I quite like the idea of it shrinking and growing as it moves, however. So let's have it as it approaches this first corner, because you can see in the original Squid Game intro scene, some of these lines here, as they approach the first corner, they do shrink down, stop, and then grow in a different direction. Okay, so let's go back and try that. So we'll have this move, and just before it hits this corner here, let's keyframe it. Okay, let's keyframe at 18.4 and we'll just delete this ending keyframe. So now at the moment, what's happening here, let's change that to 18.3, see if we can't get rid of that little bulge. 18.35. Perfect. Now what happens here is our shape grows. The back still continues to catch up. And what we want is it also to stop. So let's say at the same point here, let's keyframe it and it's going to go to say 16.8. Let's try an even round 17. That looks about right. Maybe even a 17.5. We're just looking for something that's a square just before it turns the corner. So 17.3, it looks like will do perfectly. So now we have a perfect square on the corner here. It's going to come in. And then of course, at the moment, our ending position also needs to continue to animate. But what we can do is have our square hold in this position, okay? So we can copy this keyframe, move over, say, 10 frames and paste it. Now, you might get a little bit of bumping, okay? But that's really easy to fix. You can just select all your keyframes and press F9, and that will stop that weird little bump happening there. So now we have a line that moves down, stops on the corner, and continues into the other section here. What we don't want is that weird bit where the end catches up, or the start catches up with the end. So we will just add in those other keyframes. And now we have a portion that stops. Boom. And then moves on, okay? But what I don't want is it to move off quite so fast. So let's select these keyframes here. F9, all of them. And let's just grab these on our speed graph. And if you don't see this speed graph, you need to select this little box down here and choose edit speed graph, not edit value graph. And we can just drag these in so they start off a little bit slower. Okay. Now let's take a look at that. With these two techniques, you can see how you're going to start to resolve all of these shapes into the new section. Now that moves way too fast, that bit there. So what we can do is just bring that out a little bit so it takes much longer to resolve, because some of these animations are going to take longer than the others, okay? Okay, one thing I did notice just before we do move into fast forward mode is that some of these corners do break on this line here. Very simple fix, you just need to go and twirl down your layers until you get to the stroke here and change butt cap to projecting cap. That will fix that. And then obviously you just need to come back in and tweak these options here until you get a completely flat corner. That's probably a little bit too much. Let's try 17.5. That seems to be about right. So you'll just need to come through and tweak those settings so that you get your square back after that. But what it does mean is as that then approaches the corner, you won't get any of these issues where the corner of it breaks, okay? Because you have a projecting cap, not a butt cap. So as you can see there, just changing that projecting cap fixes that little corner issue. And I just added another keyframe on this corner so that it stops there as well, just because I liked that way that it looks. And that was just using the same technique. So now we have our line that grows, shrinks, moves horizontally, and then nips into position right at the end there. Okay, great. With those two techniques, we're going to go through and just do all the rest of these animations now. And then we'll come back and we'll add in our ambient occlusion effects and other things like that. So we'll do this in fast forward and I'll see you on the other side. Okay, so one other nice thing that I like in the original Squid Game intro is that this triangle sort of scales down and slides into position like so. And obviously, we don't have any triangles in our version which are going to work well like that. What we can do is still scale these triangles down. But one thing you will notice if we take this triangle here and press S to bring up scale, and we bring it down, is that the thickness of the line decreases. And you can fix this with expressions, but seeing as our objects here are only going to scale once, the simplest way to do it is really to just keyframe your scale. And let's say it's going to take 2 seconds to scale down. You can see I've done this on a few other shapes already. Let's say we want this to scale down to 50%. for example. The simplest way to fix this is just to go back to your stroke width. And because we scaled by 50%, we can increase our stroke width by 100%. So if you were to scale to 25%, you just increase it by 200% and so on and so forth. So we've halved the size, we double the stroke width. It is at 14, we push it up to 28 and keyframe it. And if we just add some easing onto that, you'll notice that as our triangle scales down now, our stroke width remains the same, which is very nice. And then it's just a case of once it's scaled, you just do your trim path like normal, like we've been doing on the rest of our shapes. So jump back into fast forward, finish this up, and then we'll get to the fun effects part of this. Okay, and there we have it. So that's all of our animation lines done. As you can see, scaling down, sliding across, trimming, turning pink at the end, all similar stuff to what happens in the Squid Game example. So I'm going to turn off this after layer here now because we have all of the shapes that we need, so we don't need any more. So the last thing to do is to add all of these effects that make it look a little bit grainy and more analog. So a little bit of ambient occlusion, as you can see, as the shapes move here like so. And a few shadows over the tops of other shapes. Now, the shadows are easy enough to do. There's no real issues there. So let's go back to our squid lines document. And basically, there's going to be any point that you want your shape to be on top of another one. So let's take this kind of E shape, for example, here. If I just collapse all these layers, so it's a little bit easier to see what we're working with. Let's collapse all of them. Perfect. We have our rectangle E shape here, like so. And that's simply a case of right-clicking, choosing layer styles and adding a drop shadow like that. Now, because there's just black behind it, you're not really going to see this anywhere else, but it looks a little bit strong for me. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to increase the spread to make it like a harder shape and then just decrease the opacity down a little bit, like so, until we get something that we're vaguely happy with. Now, unfortunately, on this example, that's pretty much the only time that you could have something overlapping. If you wanted to, you could have it on these T-bar shapes here as well. So let's collapse that one down. This grows out from the triangle. So that means it would be triangle line left. Here, right click, layer styles, drop shadow. In this instance, we're going to have to pop these vertical lines below it, like so. And because this one does turn to pink, I'm going to increase the spread on this one as well and just turn the opacity of that way down. And I'm actually going to change it to color burn as opposed to multiply, just so it uses the color of that shading instead of the black. It uses that pink shading color. And as that obviously turns to another pink like that, it's going to look a bit nicer. Now, in the original example, these do fade away over time. So that's very simple. That's just a case of finding the point where it finishes up like so, and finding your layer style opacity keyframe on the drop shadow, moving over, say 1 second and just dropping it down to 0. So very easy to do. Let's do the same thing here on rectangle E. I only want it in a couple of places because I think that having it in a few places adds something. Having it everywhere just makes it probably a little bit of overkill. So that's how to add the nice simple drop shadow that comes into effect and then obviously fades out into the flat design at the end. Looking quite nice. Lovely job. The last thing to do is a little bit of analog. So making this a little bit analog. So next, to add this kind of glitching effect, we're going to use an effect called VR Chromatic Aberration. And this is something that's supposed to be used for virtual reality, as you can probably tell by the name. And as soon as you drop it on, you're going to see some kind of effect. What we actually want is stereoscopic side by side, and that'll only apply it to the left and right hand side of our images. And we want to crank the field of view in both cases all the way down to 60. And that gives us like a nice flat image to work with. If we crank them all the way up like so, you can see you get a bit more of a subtle effect. But pop it all the way down to 0 like this. Zero out all of your aberrations like that, which means you bring it back to 0. And then if we just give these a little bit, say 1 or 2 on each one, you can see you get a tiny amount on either side Let's try 2 on both blue and red. That looks brilliant. And what we're going to do is as these shapes come in, we're going to start them out on 0. So let's keyframe them on 0 around here. Just after the shapes have stopped blurring in. Then as they start to move, let's have this crank up to say 2 on each of these. Then let's have it move down to 1. And then by the time it's finished settling, we'll have it be 0. So now, as you can see, just as these move and blur about, they're going to get a bit more of a glitch and it's going to settle into place and disappear again. Lovely. Final thing to make this look a little bit more analog then is we're just going to add a simple noise effect on top of everything else. We don't want color noise, and we'll put it at about 9%. That just adds a little bit of speckling to our figures here. Now, we're pretty much done inside here. So let's back out into our Squid Game panel here. But as you can see at the moment, in this composition, these blacks are still visible, which is not what we want. So we're going to change this to screen mode, which allows those blacks to fade through. Now, as the camera is pulling out a little bit, you'll also notice that this is no longer like connected to the footage. It might have been in place sort of here. You know, if we were to move this backwards, you can see how, yes, that would be in place there. What we actually want to do is just scale this a little bit along with the footage. So let's go over to here. Let's zoom it out a little bit. Well, that's a pretty good guess, first of all. But let's leave it at that. Let's go to about this final point here, maybe 10 seconds to give us a nice round number. And let's pop that on 85%. And then you've got that slow drifting out as you go. So let's take a look. So there you have it, ladies and germs. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on this kind of Squid Game style effect. I could have just copied them, but you know, what's the point of that? Just tracing. We don't like that here at TipTut. So hopefully you found this enjoyable and useful. If you did, great. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, all of that jazz. And if you didn't, I'm sorry, but let me know why, and maybe I can do better next time. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time on TipTut, and be good. Absolutely massive thanks to my level 2 and above members. You guys are super lovely, and every time I'm having a bad day, I remember there's a bunch of randos out there that like my content enough to give me money each month. So great, thanks for that.
Remember to subscribe for more tips, tricks, and tutorials. Thanks for watching.